we'll start by, we'll introduce ourselves and then you can introduce yourself.
I'm Stacy Cheney, Senior Attorney Advisor at NTI, National Telecommunications and Information Administration.
John Riley, Attorney Advisor, Copyright Office.
Julie Saltman, Assistant General Counsel of the Copyright Office.
Anna Chavez, Assistant General Counsel of the Copyright Office.
Mr. Miranda?
Robert Miranda, founder and owner of SmartX.
Kit Walsh, I'm a Senior Staff Attorney at the Electronic Frontier Foundation here in support of the proposed exemption.
Kyle Weeds, I'm founder of Equity here in support.
Matt Zeminski, Logistics and Quality at Pulse in support.
Matt Williams from MSK representing AAP, ESA, and PAA and RIAA.
I'm Tom Mooney with Harmon. I lead our global public affairs show.
Okay, good morning. Before we start, I just wanted to sort of let you know how we're planning to proceed because there are a lot of issues at play in this particular exemption. So we sort of see that there are 5 different categories of, or we've sort of like divided the possible expansions into 5 categories, and we're going to go through each one in turn. So I'd appreciate if you could sort of direct your comments to the issue that we're talking about at the time, and also because we have a lot to cover in just 2 hours, please keep your responses as sort of short and direct as possible. So I'd like to start with the EFF's request to expand the exemption to cover non-motorized land vehicle devices or other devices, and also address the modification or tinkering aspect that they raise. Then we'll talk about telematics and entertainment systems. After that, third-party repair, and then federal tools. So, I'm going to direct my first question to Ms. Walsh. You've asked for an exemption for modification and repair of various types of devices, including Internet of Things devices, appliances, computer peripherals, toys. Are you limiting your request to consumer devices?
No, just as with the security research exemption, it's important that devices not necessarily intended for individual consumers be repaired. So for instance, power generator systems, control systems, computer systems are in a wide variety of devices. I think probably some of my colleagues could speak to more examples of the non-consumer devices as well.
And what evidence is there in the record that there's a need for an exemption for those type of devices?
So I think I'd like to ask my colleagues to address that.
Sure. Is there anything in the record yet, or is this going to be new?
I mean, we under the.
I'm sorry to interrupt. For the court reporter, if you could please all say your name before you start speaking.
Kyle Weeds. The Copyright Office found that there was standing for a exemption for repairing agricultural equipment. I would refer to a lot of discussions.
Okay. So in terms of the devices discussed in your submissions, some of these devices are devices that where the TPM would control access to more expressive works, and some of the devices seem like they are less likely to control expressive works. How could the office craft an exemption that is supported by the statutory analysis that covers both types of devices?
So a lot of the opposition to the class is oriented towards concerns about infringement. So you might have opposition in regard to video game consoles and in regard to devices that entail entertainment products. So there are 2 ways that the exemption as proposed is limited so that it doesn't speak to those products. The first is it's about access to software. So you're allowed to circumvent in order to, the class of works is software. The second is the proposal is that the class will only cover non-infringing uses. So to the extent that there's concern about infringement, that's still covered not only by ordinary copyright law, but also not subject to the proposed exemption.
So In terms of, let me start with video game consoles. How is expanding this exemption to video game consoles different than an exemption for jailbreaking video game consoles, which the Register has rejected twice out of concern for piracy and infringing uses that could follow for that?
So there are two components here. There's repair, which we've been using broadly for repair, diagnosis, maintenance of video game consoles. And then there's modification. So in regard to modification, it would include the ability to jailbreak a video game console.
So since we've decisively rejected that in multiple past rulemakings, and why should we reconsider that conclusion?
You look like you're champing at the bit.
Well, I would encourage maybe Robert can explain a little bit of the situation on the ground. He runs a repair shop in Barstow that fixes game consoles.
Robert Miranda. So we are a general electronics repair company. If this may help, so let's say a consumer brings in let's say a PS4, for example, and their drive isn't working where the disc inserts. If we wanted to replace that drive, we couldn't just pull out the drive, put a new part in, as if it was a car. You can change the tire, good to go. The new drive is software locked to the motherboard, which that plugs into, and it causes the drive not to work at all. So essentially what you have to do is you have to replace all the internals, which has an economical impact that the repair price is $300, $400 more than what the device is even worth. And it goes into other e-waste problems, multiple problems like that. Essentially, not having that software lock between the devices would allow us to properly serve the community, because there's no near service centers anywhere. It takes 4 weeks for someone to even get a device repaired if they had to send it out.
So you don't think that you then can't send it out and get it repaired by the video game manufacturers?
Yeah, but it's not necessarily repair, it's a console swap. They would get something different. They wouldn't get their old console. They would lose a lot of saved data content. So by us providing this service, we'd be able to reduce costs. We'd be able to prevent a lot of e-waste. We'd be able to, even as far as just have the consumer be able to fix the same day versus waiting a long time for something simple.
And aren't those consoles generally covered by warranties, just in terms of the cost of repair?
So, there's a 1-year manufacturer warranty on these devices, but there's a lot of consumers that we serve that don't have warranty, and they don't have any other option.
Mr. Williams?
Thank you.
Matt Williams.
I wouldn't say they don't have any other option. I think we have submitted evidence both in the 2015 proceeding and in this proceeding that shows that the console manufacturers can do the repairs. There are 1-year warranties, and then there are also extended warranties available as well. And then pricing may vary depending on what type of repair needs to be done. I don't think it's accurate to say that in all instances of repair, all the content on the console would be lost, but I need to speak directly to the console manufacturers about that. But I don't think there's anything in the record to this point at all that speaks to the situation on the ground being any different than it was 3 years ago. So I don't think there's any grounds for making a different decision here.
Mr. Zminski?
Yeah, Matthew Zeminski. Our organization represents 2,000 technicians that are mobile, that promise a service that can come to you and do a repair in 60 minutes or less. And right now with game consoles and certain smartphone repairs, we cannot guarantee that because there are software locks that tie components to each other that arbitrarily make it so that we cannot complete that repair. And it maybe was not as big of a problem 3 years ago as it is now, but I think that the problem right now is that more and more consumers have these devices in places that these manufacturers don't have service facilities, whereas our technicians are in places like Omaha or Lincoln, Nebraska. We can do that repair in a customer's home and get them set up that same day. Otherwise, they have to ship it out.
Does the lock on that you have to circumvent to repair, like a physical piece, like the disc port or whatever. By circumventing that lock, do you have access to creative content as well, to actual games?
The only thing when we do a repair that we are actually doing is taking a new component that, taking the old broken component out, putting the new component in, and maybe firing it up, turning it on with the customer to verify that it works.
What types of devices are you repairing?
As an organization, we repair iPhones, Google Pixel devices, Samsung devices. We're starting to do TV installations and smart home appliances, and we've done some odd jobs for game consoles as well.
And in what instances have you needed to undergo to circumvent TPMs or been prohibited because it would require certain things?
Sure. So primarily we do smartphone repairs, and there's on an iPhone, for example, if you have a home button that has Touch ID, that is digitally paired with the logic board. It's very common the way that these phones were designed that on the iPhone 5S, for example, as soon as you open it up, you tear that cable. It's very easy if you open it up too far. Because we don't have access to certain things that make that repair viable, we essentially cannot complete the repair if that cable is torn. You've now lost that capability of having your Touch ID. So what we have to do is either tell the customer, hey, you have to get a new device from the manufacturer, or we can replace it and you can just restore functionality of your basic home button. This was an issue a couple years ago in the news where it actually ended up shutting down devices entirely just for this lone reason. It was a solvable reason, but it happened.
Do you have any other examples?
For us specifically, no, not immediately.
Mr. Williams?
Thank you. Matt Williams. I think Mr. Zeminski referred to the blocks as arbitrary, and I think the record's been established that with video game consoles specifically, they are not arbitrary. They're integral to the overall design of it's intended to protect the copyrighted content that's accessible through the consoles. So
on that point, if an access control to repair some physical component of the console were circumvented, are you saying that that could allow for access to creative content?
Yes, my understanding is that most of the repairs that have been talked about would result in a jailbroken console.
And so then like a subsequent user, like not the repair person, but the user when they get the device back would then have sort of like enhanced access to the creative content. Is that what you're saying?
Yes, they could play unauthenticated copies of games and pirate copies of games.
Okay, thank you. And I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, that was the main point that I wanted to make. Some of these other devices that are coming up kind of for the first time really in the record, it's hard to respond to whether each type of device would involve the same type of problems that I'm describing, but I don't think that there's anything in the written record that establishes that really any kind of device can't be repaired through the same types of channels that video game consoles can be repaired. And I think that when you are talking about devices that are designed to access expressive works, that the countervailing interest of preventing the unauthorized access outweighs the need to get to independent repair. If you're dealing with motor vehicles, you've decided that's not the case. If you set aside entertainment systems, and maybe there's some other device that is more in that line, it's not designed to access expressive material. But I don't think I've even seen an example like that in the record.
Mr. Means, and if you have any examples of what Mr. Williams was just describing.
Sure, yeah, I'd love to. Okay, when we want to give the customer the device back in the exact state that they give it to us, which means the device absolutely should not be jailbroken. It should be locked down. There shouldn't be any additional ability to pirate content. The goal is not to expand the functionality of the device in any way. The goal is I have a physical optical drive that's broken. That's one of the most common things that fails. It's mechanical, it spins around, it's got a laser, it fails. We want to be able to replace that drive for people, or put the drive in place.
So would it be reasonable then to have a limitation in the exemption to that? Like basically having it be returned to the state that it was in before the repair was attempted to be made?
I believe ESS language is in that vein, yes.
But I'd also stress the importance of modification. So that includes many of the examples that we put into the record about you need to modify to use competitive light bulbs, to use competitive cat litter, printer cartridges, etc. That sort of consumables market is one where modification is necessary in order to get the value out of the thing that you paid for and prevent unfair monopolies from being the result of leverage of DRM. I see a question. There are other examples of enhanced functionality of drones and radios and other devices that we put in.
And just on the first point, relating to Ms. Chevet's question, do you think the definition of repair in section 117D is consistent with what you're seeking with respect to repair? I understand it doesn't include modification.
So section 117D sort of breaks out the concepts of maintenance and repair, and the concept of repair that we're all talking about includes maintenance. It also includes a diagnosis component. And it should be clear, I think under that definition it's clear, but it should be clear that if you're repairing a bug or a vulnerability or something in the original device, that's repair, even if it's not authorized by the manufacturer.
I'd also note that this really comes down to the design of the device. We don't want repair of these devices to have to depend on the copy protection mechanism. It just so happens that the way that a couple manufacturers decided to design their product meant that the component that was most likely to fail cannot be replaced without also replacing the most expensive part of the console. And it was an explicit design decision that absolutely did not need to happen. It should be very possible to swap out the optical drive without compromising the authentication function.
Like you said, it's what Mr. Williams just said, which is that although one exists in part to encourage copyright owners to somebody who works digitally, they designed a lock in this way because I guess they've determined this is what they need to do in order to incentivize them making this available in the first place.
If you think about every person that has a failed console has to go out and spend $400 on a new console, that's $400 that they aren't spending on games.
But I think we just established it can be repaired under warranty, right? Is that not a
I mean, these consoles, I mean, and this is credit to the manufacturers. I have an Xbox that I've had it for 4 years. The warranty only covered the first 25% of the time that I've had it. So warranty, usually these failures, particularly the optical drive, it's a wear component, it's a mechanical component. They don't generally fail within the first 12 months. They fail 2, 3, 4 years after.
Mr. Williams?
Thank you. I credit that Mr. Weeks doesn't necessarily want to enable any kind of infringement through engaging in repair, but I don't think there's anything in the record to show that the consoles have been designed in the way that they are for any reason other than copyright protection and basic functionality of the consoles. I don't think I've heard yet an affirmative representation that they can repair the consoles in all instances and put the copyright protection scheme back in place to avoid returning a jailbroken console. We did say in our comments that it would be far preferable if a repair exemption included the 117 language that requires you to get back to the original functionality. Of course, this proposal goes way beyond that and goes even to modification and to jailbreaking, but even if that was included in a repair exemption, I would have a lot of concern because, and I know it's a separate bucket today, but when you get into the repair shop scenario, not everyone might be as well intentioned as Mr. Weens, and if you've got all these repair shops that are supposedly returning consoles back to their original functionality, trying to go out and police all of that would be very, very difficult, and I think it would be prone to a lot of abuse.
So if there were an exemption which was crafted around repair and maintenance in 117D more tightly and not extending to third parties, and I understand we're going to talk about other things after this, but what is the concern from the point of view of your clients in terms of the statutory factors?
Sure. So, number one, I'm not very confident that they can actually restore the copyright protection systems on the consoles.
Maybe they can't make use of the exemption, but 117D says this is a non-infringing use if you can restore functionality.
Well, 117D says that's a non-infringing use if you're an owner of software. In this instance, that cannot be the case. I understand that sometimes you've gone beyond that when you've determined that in specific instances the record justifies it. Our position would be that 117 would not cover this activity because it's limited to owners of copies of software. Setting that to the side, in the past, when you've looked at this issue, because of the potential harms involved, you've said that the activity involved with copying of the software is a different analysis on their use factors and under the 1201 factors. The potential harm that could be caused is much greater. So I just think they're a very different category of devices. I don't think there's anything in the record to establish that they can restore these devices to their functionality. I think a lot of what we're hearing today, we're hearing for the first time. And if you're gonna kind of go back on some of what you decided in the past in this space, which is a very sensitive space, I feel like there should have been a much bigger record built and a much stronger attempt to prove up what they're now testifying to.
Ms. Walsh, could you speak to that? Because you know, the record is pretty thin on the different types of devices mentioned in your comment, and the sort of fair use and statutory factor analysis is done sort of wholesale, not device specific. And I think that could you speak to Mr. Williams' concern and also how the office would have the authority to craft a broad exemption that includes, for example, both devices that do have access to creative content, devices that don't?
Sure. So this is an area that's been subject to prior rulemaking with regard to cars, subject to an extensive study by the office that found that Congress should consider getting 1201 out of the way of repair activities. We have a record that stretches back in that regard. And we introduced a variety of devices, of different types, different uses that illustrate that this is not an issue that's restricted to any particular technology. We have an opposition that says, well, we're concerned that this isn't appropriate for video game consoles or devices where there's a risk of copyright infringement. There's nothing in the record that proves that there's a risk of copyright infringement. So the idea that the record is thin.
Are you talking outside of video game consoles?
Mm-hmm. Right, in
So
this class.
Consoles, put the consoles to the side.
Yep. So we have devices from across the spectrum where we have examples of non-infringing uses, and we have a sort of narrow opposition. And I think the approach of, we think that the entire exemption is warranted, that it's been demonstrated that there are likely to be adverse effects on these non-infringing uses in the next 3 years. And to the extent that there's a desire to carve out a video game console or devices that are primarily about the playback of audiovisual works or sound recordings, that's something that we can talk about how to scope that so that it's limited. But we're talking about balancing the right to make these non-infringing repairs and modifications that are in the record, that are being described further here, against an unproven assertion that copyright infringement is going to result for a narrow category of those devices.
Well, I would like to discuss how to scope it so it's limited, because this is something we ask questions about in the study, and then we get a tremendous amount of feedback. We also ask questions in the NPR round. For example, the study asked about language that the United Kingdom has for its own anti-circumvention law, which is, I think, somewhat similar to what the MPA suggested. I mean, can you build upon that now?
Come back to it.
All right, Mr. Williams.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think the record has established that, especially with respect to modification, that there's a lot of non-infringing uses as an issue here. We talked some in Washington about wanting to modify a robotic dog. That's not a non-infringing use. Just because you wish that the copyright owner designed something differently doesn't give you the right to start redesigning it. So I don't think, especially with modification, that there's a lot of examples of non-infringing uses that are being impeded. You know, I'm thankful to hear that they're open to carving out expressive works. I think that drafting is going to be very, very difficult to do, and I do think it's their burden to try to come up with a way to do it that doesn't put expressive works at risk. And I'm happy to engage in that exercise. I do want to say, hopefully we can set video games to the side, but I want to say it's a little surprising how much time we spent talking about them, because I think the only example involving a video game console is jailbreaking it to run Linux on it, and that's been dealt with previously, and so there's not anything about repairing consoles.
So I appreciate that we're focusing on consoles because it is an item that the components cut up. If we set aside the consoles, are the concerns you articulated, I think, in response to the last question you were called upon about the record, are they there in these instances of, you know, consumer devices that might not be turned like a video game or music or audiovisual alert, or do you think that they're lessened in terms of the infringement risk or uncertainty risk?
I mean, in terms of our interest, yes, I think they're lessened. I think in some ways, EFF raised a good point by saying that there are devices that do more than just that, but that also do that, also access expressive works, and that when you're talking about modification especially, that also repair, you could put works at issue, even if you're talking about a laptop, for example, and I don't think there's any explanation in the record as to why you have to engage in circumvention to repair a laptop, why you can't go through the normal channels to repair. There's just an off reference to wishing to repair a personal computer, and so there's really no record. And so, you know, part of our participation every 3 years, while we are focused on, of course, trying to preserve our interests, is also to make sure we preserve the procedural kind of rules of the road here, because once you do something in one area, out of a desire to try to address a concern that's been raised, if you do that, even though the record's not been built, that precedent gets set, and over time, the exceptions start to swallow the rule, and the procedures don't have real meaning. And so I do have that concern that I don't feel the record's been built, even if you are going to exclude things that get to expressive materials, but that would greatly lessen our concern if you figured out a good way to do it.
Mr. Weeks, do you want to speak about that, and perhaps Mr. Williams' questioning of personal computers specifically, and any other, I guess, his sense of the record?
Sure, I mean, we're looking at electronics moving into every possible product. It's the ability to build a record across every single product that's out there being repaired.
Well, but there's a difference, right, between building a record across every single product and building a record across a large amount of products. And the rate of submissions here were honestly quite short.
Sure, and I'm happy to share we have, I was just looking at our Xbox 360 Red Ring of Death repair, and over 1 million people follow our instructions to repair that console. There's a huge amount of interest out there in the public. The challenge is that, frankly, the repair world are not also IT lawyers. And there's a very narrow bench to draw on of repair shops that can afford to. I mean, Robert doesn't have a lawyer. Right? He's a small shop that's employing. You've got 3 people that work for you, 5. So he's up to 5 employees in Barstow. But I mean, the repair industry is oftentimes holding on by our fingertips.
And we appreciate you all being here. So since we do have the benefit of your presence, can you give us some specific examples?
In around game consoles or around other products?
Outside of pieces.
Sure. That have TPMs you're looking for? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're increasingly seeing, as you start seeing security threats, there was a casino that was hacked through a temperature sensor in a fish tank in the lobby. And so that every single product as electronics added to it also is having some kind of security mechanism that's added to it. Turns out it's not sufficient to add Wi-Fi to your fish tank monitor. Now you also need to add security to it. And so you're going to see across every product some elements of security being added to it. LG, since the beginning of 2017, hasn't sold any appliances that aren't Wi-Fi connected. And in LG's opposition that they filed on the right to repair bill, they've said that they don't want people modifying, tinkering with, or repairing their appliances because of the security implications. So it shows that we're starting to see TPMs being added across every kind of product. Now, not necessarily to prevent repair, but to secure the product. But the side effect is that it really starts to limit repair.
But for a lot of those products, like LG home appliances, I mean, those are generally covered by warranties and are, there's not necessarily a need for circumvention outside of those channels.
Sure, so your typical warranty is 12 months. The anticipated lifespan of an appliance would be in the 10-year range. A recent study by RAP, Waste Reduction Agency, found that 70% of consumers were dissatisfied with the lifespan of their appliances. If you take game consoles, for example, we manufactured hundreds of millions of game consoles. If every one is 5 to 10 pounds, you're talking about literally over 1 billion pounds of e-waste that's being generated. This is massive amounts of raw material. Warranty is nice, it's a nice idea. But overwhelmingly, products don't break within the first 12 months, they break after that. And that's where you need the repair ecosystem, whether that's owners or the manufacturers have a great repair mechanism, but it's insufficient. It's always going to be insufficient. The car manufacturers know that they can only perform about a quarter of the repairs that happen on cars themselves. The rest is performed in the independent repair industry.
So why is it insufficient? Is it price? Is it something else?
Why is the warranty insufficient?
No, why is LG's repair services?
Yeah, so let's talk about Apple's battery situation. So Apple was slowing down phones with older batteries. People realized all of a sudden that your battery needs to be replaced. Apple has manufactured around 1 billion iPhones. Of those 1 billion iPhones, most of them are more than 2 years old and need a new battery. Apple has 5.
But you don't need to circumvent to replace the battery, or do you?
At the moment, no, but it's very possible that. Well, actually. Yeah, so actually, yes. Apple rolled out a new software tool that lets you monitor the battery health. Only Apple's genuine batteries will report battery health to the software. So we're going to have to find some way, and there may be a TPM, we don't know, but it's very possible.
It's a little speculative. There may be a TPM and you don't know, and you can't replace the battery without circumvention. I mean, can you come up with a concrete example of where you need to circumvent for repair?
Sure. Well, the home button situation. So right now you have 2 iPhone 8s. You cannot swap the home buttons on the iPhone 8s without circumventing the TPM. And it's not the same TPM as jailbreaking the phone. It's a different one.
Mr. Ziminski, did you want to speak to cell phone?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that, when we're doing these types of swaps with a home button or an optical drive, we're not even taking a non-Sony or a non-Samsung or a non-Apple part. We may in fact take from what we call a donor device, right, that's already broken for another reason, inoperable, and we're just trying to transfer it over to make a salvage workable device for a variety of reasons. And what we find is that even using an OEM, original equipment manufacturer part, it does not work. And that kind of causes major issues. So even when we try to use original parts, we still find these roadblocks to performing successful repair for the consumer. And then further, the second point would just be that a lot of times these services are not even acknowledged to a certain point. So with Apple and the home button, the Error 53 issue, this was ignored for, I believe, 2 years. It took, Kyle writing a blog post, and then a year later it took, a news outlet picking it up before even a year after that, in class action lawsuit were filed, that Apple said, okay, this is an actual issue, and we'll start to do service from our centers for this issue.
Do you ever reach out to Apple or Sony or any of these manufacturers and get permission for repair? Do you understand when it's prohibited? What's the relationship there like?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we try. Obviously, we always try to work with them rather than against them or alongside them. And in most cases, what's that?
Is there typically success?
Off and on. It depends on the manufacturer. So our organization, for example, we work very closely with Google to do pixel repairs, right? And as a result, we're able to do more repairs locally or regionally for the Google Pixel customers.
Just very quickly, I wanted to note again that there are extended warranty options as well, so it's not always a 12-month warranty. I think the Microsoft, I think they call it the complete warranty. I think it's 3 years and includes things like if you spill a drink on your console, it breaks, things like that. So just to say it's not always 12 months.
Ms. Walsh, and could you also address, in your submission, you argued that you didn't think 1201F was sufficient coverage for the kind of modification that you're looking to do. Could you expand on that argument a little bit and explain why you think 1201F doesn't cover the kinds of modification that you're seeking here?
Sure. So first of all, I want to talk about why modification generally can be expected to be a fair use in this context, the context that we've been talking about. And one reason is that this is modification of the functionality of software in order to achieve new functional things. It's transformative. It's not using any expressive copyrightable elements of the software in an expressive.
How are we to know that? I mean, that seems like a broad assertion, that it's not using the software. It seems like you're talking about creating a derivative work.
Right, well, we're talking about all the pieces that we're talking about. We're doing the fair use analysis on a potential derivative work.
Right.
And so in the sense that it is an alteration of the copyrighted work, then the copyrighted work is involved. But these are copyrighted works that are primarily functional. So both under the second factor, we're talking about things with a thin copyright whose significance is functional. That's not something you can get a monopoly on under copyright law. The transformations that we're talking about are about adding new functionality or even new expression. In the example of you want the IBO to say the things that you want it to say instead of the things that it's originally programmed to say. That's not that's a transformative use, and it's even more clear when we're talking about light bulbs and other devices where it's entirely about the functionality.
But it seems like the fourth factor is really sort of the most, well, I mean, generally is the most probative one, and here there isn't in your submissions an analysis of the fourth factor with respect to these different types of devices.
So the fourth factor is often in favor of fair use in this case because you have software that's tied to a particular device. You can't upload just the firmware that runs a device and get the benefit of owning that device. There's a physical product that it's tied to. So it's very unlikely that there's going to be market substitution as a result of these works, where the work's utility and market value is connected to a physical device.
Right, there's nobody out there selling this firmware. We were talking about the cellular unlocking, and no one, you're not seeing Broadcom concerned about piracy of the software that runs on their chips. So the commerciality of the firmware is purely tied to the functionality of the physical device.
Mr. Williams, do you think?
Yeah, thank you. Matt Williams. I just disagree with the fair use analysis that Ms. Walsh presented. And I think, number one, it's impossible to do it as one big analysis that covers all modifications of all devices that include software. But even setting that to the side.
Well, can you tease that out a little bit?
Sure.
So why is it impossible to do it sort of like a broad fair use analysis?
Well, sure. So, okay, there's a few reasons. First, as you acknowledged in the previous rulemakings, game consoles, for example, it's a different analysis because of what's involved with modifying that software. The modifications in that instance not only alter the firmware, but also decrease its value because it no longer can protect the copyrighted works that it was designed to protect. And that changed the way you viewed those types of modifications under the fourth factor because the firmware value was on. In each device, things like that can come up. The second part of it is what is the modification you're trying to accomplish? I mentioned the robotic dogs. I don't think that is a non-infringing use. I think that is the ways that someone might modify a robotic dog are ways that the copyright owner might choose to market new versions of that dog in the future. And when you do that, you avoid paying the customary price for that potential modification that's going to come out in the future. So I think that it's very hard to just say blanket across the board, and this is what the 1201 study concluded as well, all modifications are fair use. And if you look at the Oracle opinion and the way that they analyzed the previous interoperability cases they say that even in those previous cases, which involved the creation of entirely new works that didn't include any of the expressive elements of the pre-existing software, that was only a moderately transformative activity. And here, I think what's being described in every instance would not be the creation of an entirely new work. That they're not just wanting to analyze the pre-existing software and build an interoperable add-on to it. They're wanting to actually modify the existing software and create a derivative work, as you said, and to make a blanket conclusion about that in the abstract, I just don't think it's possible.
Ms. Walsh?
Yeah, so it's not abstract. There are a lot of examples that we've given to which this analysis applies, and the objections that we're hearing are, well, maybe it doesn't apply to video games and dogs. But we've demonstrated that it's likely that there are going to be adverse effects on non-infringing uses over the next 3 years. And by creating an exemption that authorizes those uses, the non-infringing modifications for these devices, then you're fulfilling the statutory mandate of creating space for these non-infringing activities to take place. So the analysis that we've given, there aren't a lot of objections to applying that to the examples that are in the record. Also, Oracle v. Google was wrongly decided. It's not the law anywhere. If we go by what the Federal Circuit says, then 1201 requires a nexus to infringement. It doesn't get the analysis of the factors right in terms of transformativeness or the nature of the work.
Would you say the most helpful case law to your position is, say, Vertackley in the context case, or are other cases you would point to?
Refer you to our record.
Oh, that's what I saw in there.
And can you address the 1201F question I asked earlier?
Yeah, absolutely. So 1201F has, to my knowledge, never been successfully raised as a defense to anything because of limitations that are sort of well known to the Copyright Office and have been briefed over and over. In particular, a very significant limitation is that it's about making one piece of software interoperable with another piece of software. And we've been talking a lot about hardware interoperability. That's the closest sort of case to 1201F, and it likely, a rights holder would argue it gets knocked out because it's not just about software and software. So 1201F.
Did you cover the gimbal example or the radio example in your submissions?
Mm-hmm. So both of the gimbal example involved additional hardware.
If it's also about software, it might cover it.
Yeah, I think there's sufficient legal uncertainty given this defense that's never been successfully applied that people are chilled from engaging in these activities and relying on that exemption, as we've seen repeatedly for other exemptions over those rulemakings.
Do you have more information on what the circumvention activity is in? I kind of want to walk through a lot of the examples for the radio and the gimbal examples to start with.
Yeah, so we provided links to the descriptions that the technologists gave of their process, as well as a short summary. So which example would you like to?
I guess let's start with
the cat?
Yeah,
The cat tracker. So this is.
They didn't find much explanation in the video of what the circumvention activity was.
Okay. So the step, the user had to brute force the encryption on a file from the firmware's RAM and decrypt the firmware blocks in order to achieve control over the gimbal and reprogram the motors for new uses. So the decryption step would be the step where a TPM is most likely to be involved.
And what are the TPMs and the consumable examples that you gave?
So, let's see. So we referred to ink, coffee, juice, cat litter box, cleaning fluid. I understand also that since this has happened, there have been consumables for use with artificial pancreases, so actually a medical device use where there's a technological restriction on making third-party life-sustaining medicine work with the device that you've been given.
The cat leather DRM, I mean, you could just use soap and water to refill your cat leather. But the DRM was, I mean, it was just very similar to what you see on the ink cartridge. was just a little chip in the replacement.
It's the Lexmark case included, maybe the TPM was effectively protecting copyrighted work, so that's part of why I'm asking this line of questions.
So you're at
Yeah, I mean, does it work like the Lexmark picture cartridges, does it work differently?
for, so I think for all of these, I would have to, so you're saying that you took a look at the cited references and they didn't provide an answer to that information?
I was trying to understand more.
So for ink cartridges, Lexmark is one example of how it worked, and that was contingent on the way that they had designed it then. So the company could decide that they're going to design it to include, a poem in the chip as well, or something that that is more arguably copyrightable, and create to add Section 1201 as a legal barrier. One of the obstacles is you don't know what's in there until you bypass the TPM. So from the perspective of a user who wants to make their cat litter box work, they can't know beforehand if bypassing that TPM is going to lead to a Section 1201 claim.
I pulled up the source code for the cat litter pack just to see. And so it looks like there's a RFID chip on the cat litter module, and so I guess he could have probably cut out the RFID chip and put it on his new cartridge, but instead what he did was create a custom firmware. So he took the existing firmware, decompiled it, made modifications, and removed the check, and then loaded it onto the cat litter robot. So I would say it's almost more in the category of modification than repair, I would say.
Ms. Walsh, just to clarify, your initial submission limited modification, so not repair, modification to device owners. Is that your position that should the class of people who are exempted from modification are the owners of the devices?
I think it would be appropriate to use language like users of the copyrighted work. The third-party issue has surfaced in the rulemaking. So for the same reasons, it's not necessarily just the device owner who would legitimately be making these modifications.
So the current exemption was adopted in part on a finding that 117 might provide a basis for non-infringing uses, and that would go away if it changed to user owners, perhaps.
Section 17 requires that someone be the owner of the copyrighted work, but I believe they can authorize someone else to do it. Is that? Let me double check that.
Yeah, you can make or authorize the making.
Yeah. So that would be my answer to that. Is that? But I would also say that the fair use analysis for activities that overlap with Section 117 is bolstered by the presence of Section 117, even if you are not the owner of the copyrighted work. And I'd also say that there isn't evidence in the record for most of the devices that we're talking about to counter the presumption that the person who purchased the device is the owner of that copy of the copyrighted work.
Would you find that the authorization of the owner of the device might be an important consideration in the analysis of whether these activities are likely to be non-infringing?
Can you give an example?
Well, as opposed to just the user, the authorization of the owner is language that's in 117. So I'm wondering whether.
Oh, I see. It provides an additional basis for finding that it's not infringing, but it's also not infringing as a fair use.
Mr. Williams?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond. Ms. Walsh said there's a presumption that everyone owns copies of the software unless somehow the record has been proven otherwise. I don't know that there's any basis for such a presumption. I think the proponents have the burden of establishing that the consumers do own this software. I don't think they've even tried to do that.
When you buy a device, unless there's some documentation that alters your legal status with regard to the device, then you're the owner of that copy of the software that's in this device.
This is Matt Williams. There's a multi-factor analysis depending on which court you look at, but in all instances that we've seen in rulemaking, there are terms of service associated with acquisition of copies of software. Sometimes people are the owners of them and sometimes they are not, but I don't think the burden shifts in this rulemaking to us under some kind of presumption that if we don't establish lack of ownership, that they have successfully established ownership. I don't think they've introduced any of the terms of purchase or terms of use for any of the software.
So it's absolutely not the case that all of the examples of purchased products that have been subject to rulemaking come in terms of service. I don't know if that's what you intended to say, but that's not the case. And the multi-factor analysis that Mr. Williams invoked comes after there's some document that purports to restrict the rights of the user. It's also not an issue that needs to be deeply probed in the sense that fair use provides a basis for finding these activities non-infringing without resort to Section 117. But Section 117, excuse me.
Yeah, thank you. I understand that in certain instances, the Copyright Office has concluded that it's going to go outside the boundaries of Section 117, but I think to just completely discard it and pretend that it's not there would be an improper way to proceed in this proceeding, just because in some specific instances it might be non-infringing or fair use to copy or modify software. Doesn't mean that in every instance it should be. And to just say that it never matters whether we own the copy would really be to ignore Section 117. I don't think that would be proper.
Do you think whether you're the owner of a device is relevant to the first factor or other factors of 107? I think that was something we considered with the current exemption.
So whether you own the device, does that impact the nature of the use? I think it could. I think it might depend on what activity you're talking about. I think, for example, if you clearly weren't the owner of a device and you went into someone else's computer system and started playing around with it, that could negatively impact you under the first factor.
Even if you had authorization?
Well, if you had authorization by the owner of a device, then under 117, if they own the software as well, then you would potentially be covered if you met all the other requirements of 117. Under Section 107, I again think it would depend on the activity, and I think to say that in every instance, if the activity is repair, it is therefore fair use, would again read Section 117 out of the statute.
Mr. Means, I know your placard was up, but I want to hear Ms. Walsh's response to that.
Sure. So I'd add that under the appropriate analysis of Section 117, even if there is a EULA in place, the person who owns the device is typically also the owner of that copy of the software. So under Krauss, you look at indicia like, are they free to dispose of it, et cetera, and that is generally, I don't think there's a counterexample in the record of the way that users are exercise the indicia of ownership over that physical copy and ought to be considered for purposes of their 117 rights to be owners.
I think Mr. Williams must have questioned it in the context of video game console, but also just in general trying to understand the devices. Do you see any merit to sufficient?
So what's the question?
What about video game consoles? Is that right, Mr. Williams? Did you question whether the owner of a video game console owns the software in that console?
Yes, my understanding is that those are licensed copies of software, and I think that under Werner, for example, the fact that the console manufacturers are providing ongoing support and repair services and requiring that those avenues be used actually weighs in favor of the conclusion that it's a licensed copy of software, because one of the Werner factors is the additional restrictions are placed on the use beyond just calling it a license. And with game console software, I think those additional restrictions are.
But you're free to resell your video game console, you're free to dispose of it, you don't return it to the manufacturer at the end of the purchase of 117, you're the owner of the software that operates the video game console.
Mr. Means.
Yep. I wrote an article about this because in the last Triennial, John Deere said that the farmer is not the owner of the copy of the software on the device. So I wrote an article explaining their position, and I got thousands of annoyed emails from farmers saying, of course I own the software. The overwhelming expectation of consumers is that they own the copy of the software on the device. And we've seen this from public reaction, we see this in our discussion. I bought my Xbox used. There was never any license agreement that I signed when I bought that Xbox. So this is, as we see electronics move into more and more products, I would say the overwhelming majority of products have no license, that have software in them, have no license agreement associated with them. When I buy, a flashlight that has software in it, there's no license agreement associated with that. I'm assuming that I'm buying the flashlight and all of it that's contained there.
Ms. Walsh?
Yeah, so I wanted to refer back. I apologize, I wasn't able to find the language in the notice of proposed rulemaking that you were asking for comment on a while ago. Could you point me to the specific language involving a UK definition?
That would have been specifically in the 1201 study, but I think we also in the NPRM that raised a question of whether we should put all devices in one hand or certain types of devices that are more that fall within the category of adverse effects and non-infringement use for modification. So I know that UK was specifically mentioned in the rulemaking NPRM.
I think we're just trying to figure out whether and to what extent the office would have authority to grant a broad or a narrower exemption and based on what record evidence. That's a fundamental question. Okay. But maybe we should move on because we have a lot to cover. So let's talk about the telematics and entertainment systems in motorized land vehicles. So I have some technical questions. And we talked about these a little bit the other day in the unlocking context, but in most car systems, the submissions discuss telematics systems in cars and also the entertainment systems in cars. Does the same TPM control access to both of those systems? Are there layers of TPMs? Are there separate TPMs? Can anyone talk about how that works technically?
Maybe I'll take a stab at it, and I'll let Mr. Mooney explain their perspective. Yes, so it's interesting. I mean, if you look at the way they describe it, they're describing it as the telematics and infotainment system. And the way that many vehicles are designed right now, telematics and infotainment systems are the same computer. That's actually unfortunate because telematics, increasingly what's happening is the diagnostics on vehicles used to come out through the OBD port or the onboard diagnostic port. It's right underneath your steering wheel. There's a little port, you can plug a reader in. It's a standardized interface across most vehicles. And that's been the primary interface historically for accessing all of like I just fixed my wife's car last weekend. It was giving me error code P0715. Turns out that's the transmission speed sensor, so I bought the sensor fixes the car. Now, as these things are getting more sophisticated, we're moving from the diagnostic data coming out through the OBD port, and it's going over the wireless. And so that's the shift between diagnostics from a physical port to diagnostics over the air, over telemetry. Unfortunately, the way that the manufacturers decided to do that is the same module that has the cellular connectivity, say for downloading new maps or new videos or streaming music, they're using that same modem for transmitting the telemetry data. And so it puts all of you in an unfortunate situation where the world of repair and the world of entertainment systems are like colliding because of maybe an accidental or a choice of efficiency of combining telematics and infotainment into the same unit.
So the telematics data you're talking about, is that data that is needed to repair sort of other parts of the car, or
Yes.
is circumvention just needed to repair the telematics system or that modem?
No, I mean this is where you would be getting access to diagnostics, like your oil needs changing. All of the diagnostic data from all of the different, there might be 25 different computers in the car, are funneled through the telematics system.
Can I ask just, I'm sorry,
No.
can I ask just, because normally with the port, right, you would just go into an auto repair store and they would plug in their device and you would get that data out and then you could buy the part right there at any auto repair store. Now, with that change, where does that telematics go, and is that where the problem lies?
Right, yeah, so this is the challenge, and it's so that same OnStar kind of signal, so that the diagnostic data is going straight back to the manufacturer. It's the same thing on tractors. The diagnostic data is going to John Deere. You log into your online John Deere account, and then you can see the error code for your tractor.
So you can't go to the auto repair store now and have them
Right.
plug into that port and get that data out.
Right.
That's no longer available as a.
And this is why AAA feels so threatened by the shift to telemetry, because it's cutting out the independent repair world, and it moves, by virtue of this TPM, it moves all of the control over who can access all that diagnostic information to being in control of the manufacturer, and not companies.
But does the consumer have control? Like you said, the consumer could log into his John Deere account and see the telematics data. So could a consumer log in, get the data, give it to a repair person who could then do the repair?
Unfortunately, that's not the way most of them are designed. John Deere's system maybe is a little bit friendlier with other cars, like a Tesla, for example. You don't see independent repair shops fixing Teslas because they don't have access to that information. Goes to Tesla servers. So what you would want to do is go into the telematics chip and say, hey, this server that you're sending all the data to, send it to my personal server instead, or send it to AAA instead. That would be the kind of modification these do. Might be as simple as changing an IP address.
Mr. Mooney?
Yeah, I was about to say, I can't speak to what's unfortunate or not. I feel like that's pretty speculative. I think there were some statements about the unfortunate design versus what was done in the past, and I can't speak to that and say that adds any kind of weight to this discussion. The other piece too is the OBD2 port is certainly very much still in effect. That has not been removed from vehicles. That is still an option for all repair.
And that's, you can get the same telematics data off the OBD.
Yeah, so the difference between OBD2, depending on what the functionality is, versus some sort of wireless over-the-air option, is that the OBD2 has to kind of physically plug in. When you're talking about wireless, it's more in a real-time manner, but the same data exists.
And do you need to circumvent any kind of access control to use the OBD2 as a non-authorized repairer?
Yes, I mean, they're and this starts to wade into a different discussion, but I mean, right now there are options for owners of a vehicle to plug in things like a progressive dongle that kind of tracks how you drive in order to kind of, you reap the benefits of safe driving on your insurance premiums, right? So there's ways to access it now. It's not physically protected in any way where you would have to go to the manufacturer. Again, that's not Harman's domain. I just want to be very clear about that. That's the OEM, the automaker's onus there. We simply provide the system that enables certain functionality.
Do you know if this diagnostics data, maybe someone else said if it were obtained after someone mentioned, is it coming in a structured or unstructured way of trying to determine if it's a fact? If you're just getting facts, it's likely to be a copyrightable compilation of data.
Yeah, so I think the point there is that, was made that there's this blending, right? And that's the infotainment. When we talk about infotainment, we're talking about the entertainment and telematics system together. There's a whole host of when you're looking at that, there's PII involved. There's also, in terms of position, navigation, and timing, states have different statutes around what that means. But then there's also the copyrightable works that are in existence on the system, or in effect, the system is enabling the streaming, the transmission, and the viewing on that entertainment system. Some things come preloaded.
Are those works covered by other TPMs as well? Like, for example, wouldn't you have to log into your Spotify account to stream it on your car?
Correct. It depends on what's preloaded and what's, so yes, there are ways that you can log in and access those things. However, some things do come preloaded, like a Waze or a SiriusXM, where they are kind of part and parcel with the infotainment system.
Ms. Walsh?
Yeah, so I just want to remind us all that one of the big harms here is a lack of competition. And so when we think about isn't there an authorized repair service that you can go to? Sure, there could be the monopolist that you can go to and get higher prices and lower quality of service than if you had a competitive market.
Mr. Walsh, I just want to push back a little bit though. Mr. Mooney just indicated that port still is available. That means I could go to any repair shop if that's the case, I could go to a new repair shop, but they could plug in their authorized device and give me the code that I need to fix it. If that's the case, then this monopoly argument doesn't work. So tell me, if that port is actually still working, then tell me how this is an issue.
Sure. So I'm going to answer that question, and then also on the other vehicle specific stuff, defer to folks who looked like they were excited about it. But last time around, we talked about the market for the creation of those diagnostic tools. And so maybe you move the monopoly to, if there's something that can be achieved over OBD, you move the monopoly to the market for providing diagnostic tools. So you mentioned it's an authorized diagnostic tool. This is something that we talked about last cycle with regard to cars, is the need for competition so that someone can make a diagnostic tool that's better or more affordable than the one that the manufacturer authorizes. It's about preventing an illegitimate monopoly at any step in the road. So the reason I raise this point is not necessarily to make a vehicle-specific point, but just to talk about, as we say, well, isn't there service from the original manufacturer? That's not addressing the harm to competition that's created by the barrier to repair or modification.
Mr. Weems?
Yeah. The OBD port does not provide all of the same information that happens over the telematics data feed. It used to be that was where you got all the information. Increasingly, there's less and less available on those OBD ports. Effectively, what they make available.
Can you specifically talk about what's available?
Yeah, so the car manufacturers are behaving in a regulated environment. So the information that they provide over OBD is the minimum that's legally required that they provide. And the requirement that they provide the information actually goes back to the Clean Air Act, which said that vehicle manufacturers have to provide information relating to the emissions system of the vehicle so that independents can maintain the emission system of the vehicle. Say you have Tesla, the Tesla Model S has an OBD port, and if you plug into it, it gives you almost no information because the Tesla doesn't do anything with regard to emissions. And so the transmission speed sensor area that I was talking about on my wife's car, Tesla doesn't have an automatic transmission. And so any information relating to how to repair the various subsystems on a Tesla are almost not coming. There's almost no information on the OBD port. Instead, it's all coming over the telemetry data that's in.
So if you circumvent the Tesla and get the telemetry data, does it come to you as in a structured manner or unstructured manner?
Yeah, that's a great question. That goes over my scope.
Well, I have a comment about compilations, which doesn't directly answer that question, but it is the Ford v. Autel lawsuit involved an assertion under Section 1201 that the set of diagnostic codes and what they meant was a protected copyrightable compilation, and that circumvention of encryption on that was an issue in that case. That's what I have to add on the compilation discussion.
Mr. Mooney?
Yeah, just like this, just Tom. Just like to add that. So, I think we're sort of inferring with this, a speculative lack of information that's coming out of the OBD2 port, is that there's some sort of one-way communication. There are sensors on that vehicle that kind of talk to the user in real time, and back to the manufacturer, and back to third parties. I mean, there's a lot of communication going on in that vehicle. The manufacturer wants you to know if there's an issue on that vehicle. So the fact that there's a statement here that you're sort of blinded by what is going on in the vehicle because you can't access telematics data, I think isn't correct. The other piece is, when you think about what telematics data is, I mean, when you think about fair use, the consumer can already sort of do what they need to do with the data. I mean, there's nothing that stops you from, say, plugging into Waze and using that position, navigation, and timing of your vehicle. The use case is very small for why you would be circumventing security controls around a very complex system on telematics and infotainment.
So you're saying that sort of without having to circumvent anything, consumers have access to most of the telematics?
In terms of how, this isn't an Xbox, right? And it's not a cell phone. It's a vehicle moving at 70 miles an hour down the road. There are safety implications around that, but I'm try to kind of stay away from that. But it's a different beast. And what you would be using telematics data for in terms of fair use can already sort of be accomplished without circumventing any kind of system of security.
And Earlier you mentioned that some of this data is PII and that this implicates various state laws. Can you give a concrete example of that?
Give me 1 second. I don't know if it'll be concrete, but I know when you start to corroborate information in terms of users, location, where they're going, their home address, and all, it becomes a person identifiable information issue.
But
and ways into privacy.
Doesn't if it's data about the person who's accessing, if the person is accessing data about themselves, is that still a PII issue? And if it is, like under what state law?
No, I don't. You know, if it's again fair use for the vehicle, I don't think it's a PII issue. I mean, if you're saying that you need to access this information or allowing a third party software like a Waze, for example, to access it, or SiriusXM, for example, to access it, that in turn, in my mind, is fair use.
So you suggested there's a small use case where you need to circumvent something. You give an example of Waze, but Mr. Owen suggested you need to circumvent, I guess, the same law in order to get diagnostics about the oil system. Is that your example, Mr. Owen? I mean, do you agree with him or disagree with him?
I question why you would need to do that. I mean, that is, well, not why, but why it's not already available to you via the warning systems on the vehicle. Again, this is OEM territory, but in my mind, when I think about this, there are display options across your dash infotainment screen that tell you that things are happening and that you should go seek a licensed provider for servicing and repair.
That's right.
Sure, I give you an example. I was in Dallas the other day, rented a car. It was 2 a.m. Got on the freeway. I was driving 5 miles down the freeway, and got a warning that flashed up. Your engine is overheating, shutting off. I pull off to the side of the road, and I realized that this particular Toyota vehicle actually did not have any readout on the dashboard at all to tell you the coolant temperature. Which is, it's one of the fundamental dials that's found on vehicles. I went through the manual, I went through everything, and it turns out that this car, the manufacturers decided that the user should not know the coolant temperature. That's an example of the kind of thing that I, as an owner, would like to know. It might have given me, it was certainly a safety issue. I couldn't believe they shut the car off on the highway without giving me any advance notice. The engine just shut off. So that would be one example where I would like to be able to know that information.
Yeah, again, I feel like this is where you're getting into, but this is OEM territory.
Sure.
I'm not an automaker. What I can say is if you pop, in most vehicles, when you pop the hood, there's something that tells you the temperature of coolants and other liquids inside the engine.
No, I mean you can open it and have steam come up, and that'll tell you. there's no. If it doesn't have a physical dial, you're out of luck. Let me give you an example of another fair use. There's a company called Comma.ai that was started by one of the founders of the iPhone jailbreaking ecosystem, and it's an aftermarket add-on to your vehicle that makes it autonomous. And he plugs into the CAN bus, he pulls in as much information as he possibly can from the vehicle to add on and make the car autonomous, which is a pretty cool extension of a vehicle, and it's building on top of all the software. The more sensors that system has access to, the safer it will be. And so by being able to tap into additional telemetry, additional sensor data, you're going to take this from a system that is reasonably safe to very safe.
Can you address the point that Harman raised in their submissions that allowing people to access telematics data creates a security concern, and that, for example, a fleet of Jeeps was hacked by security researchers through the telematics TPM?
Sure, and that was Charlie Miller who testified in the last Triennial, and I think he was actually in this room, and he told us that he had a circumvention for a major motor vehicle manufacturer, but he was afraid to talk about it because of the concerns of being prosecuted under 1201. So it turns out he responsibly disclosed the vulnerability. This is a challenge. You have, the moment you add a wireless interface to anything, you're adding a security implication, and this is a challenge. Unfortunately, we also need access to these systems to repair, and that shows the tension between, as we continue to secure these devices and add TPMs, we also need to be able to get them to perform repairs. It's very possible. We've seen this with a number of abandoned devices. We see this with appliances all the time, where the manufacturer adds wireless to a device, abandons it, stops writing security updates. The user has to come in, break through their TPM to just turn the wireless off so that they can secure their device. And certainly that would be, if I was buying a modern vehicle, Matt has a brand new Subaru with a Harman system. The first thing that I would do is go into the telematics system and turn off every wireless interface. But I think I'd be violating 1201 to do that. I don't want a car with any wireless signaling whatsoever, because I don't know how to use it. So it would be a way that I would secure a vehicle, because I understand Mr. Mooney has a lot of very talented security engineers that work for you, but I don't trust them.
This time, I don't understand that's relevant to that. What was just stated, I don't know if it's relevant to what we're kind of getting at here in the heart of the copyrighted works. So yes, there are safety implications and security implications, most definitely, and that is our concern. Yes, Charlie Miller and Chris Valasek performed some research, and the jury's still out on how responsibly it was disclosed at the end of the day. However, that is our concern, is that there are safety issues. I mean, it is, when you start to wade outside of the Copyright Office's purview, when you start talking about privacy and vehicle safety, which would fall under NHTSA, for example. But again, the scope of that challenge is so large, and it is so complex and so hard that you sort of don't want to leave it to, in the systems that are on the vehicle that do touch a Harman system potentially, or a Panasonic system potentially, or an LG system potentially, interface with the rest of the vehicle. And in some instances, safety critical functionality of the vehicle, steering, throttle, and braking. When you start to circumvent things willy-nilly, it becomes an issue, yes, for safety. I wholeheartedly agree. And it's a challenge that faces the entire industry, in a step above the entire Internet of Things business.
Thank you. So, Mr. Williams, I wanted to ask you a question that we sort of discussed at the DC hearing on repair, because I wanted to hear responses from these proponents. And it relates to the question I asked Mr. Moody. I mean, in terms of the expressive works that are contained in entertainment systems, are those protected by their own TPMs, so that piracy really isn't a concern if people are just circumventing the modem TPM to get telematics information to repair the car?
So I can't speak across the board for every type of service, because I don't know the technical specs for every type of service. But yes, my understanding is they are frequently protected by their own, at least a separate login. Although I think Mr. Mooney just referenced that sometimes that might not be the case if the service is kind of built in from the purchase date of the car. You never necessarily have to go and log in. Until your temporary subscription runs out, and then you get a communication saying, do you want to pay to stay and keep continuing? We introduced the statement from Chris Bell about some of the ways that we're concerned opening up the TPMs on the entertainment systems could expose those types of services to unauthorized access, even if they do require a login. And one of those ways was spoofing. And so if you had multiple vehicles within a family, for example, if you can get it into the system, as Mr. Bell described it, you could potentially get access to the code that identifies the authorized vehicle and spoof it into other vehicles. That's just one example. He was also concerned, and we discussed this in the Class 6 panel as well, about whether you could attach a peripheral device and start downloading copies of content that you only have subscription access to. I can't speak to whether the telematics data is sometimes that you have to hack the same TPM to get the telematics data as you would to the entertainment system. Mr. Mooney can speak better to that than I could.
Actually, I guess the same question for Mr. Mooney is that you refer to the Harman system, the Panasonic system, are those protected by their own TPMs, or is that not the right way to think of it?
Yeah, so that comes down from the OEM. That is based on requirements. So just to kind of put it in perspective, we don't go out and design, let's say an entertainment system that would go into a Chevy Volt or a Tesla Model S on our own, right? Those things are designed in advance at the manufacturer level and pushed down to the supply chain. Harman being at the top of that supply chain would then source out and just build that system based on those requirements.
Mr. Moody, in your submissions, you refer to an FCC rule mandating the lockdown of various parameters controlling radio frequency devices. Do you have more information on what the FCC rule is? Like, what is the site for that rule, and how exactly is it implicated by this?
Can you give me one second?
Yeah, sure. Mr. Weeds.
Sure, and maybe I can answer that. I think that the best way to think of these infotainment systems is it's a general purpose computer that's running lots of apps on it. One of the apps might be the Sirius FM app. On my PC, I have the Spotify app. Just because my PC is jailbroken, I have root level access to the PC, does not mean that I have access to the Spotify app. The Spotify app itself has its own TPMs, and it's protected. And I think that you can think of these infotainment systems the same way. Just being able.
Are you thinking of it as the app, or are you thinking of it as the operating system?
The infotainment system is effectively an operating system. It's a computer running an operating system. On top of that operating system, you have various apps. And so one of those apps would be Sirius. And so each of these entertainment apps are running on top of that common infotainment substrate. But just being able to access the infotainment system does not mean that I can immediately break into the app and get access to the copyrighted content. And I think thinking of these systems as general purpose computers is probably a better framework as we move into more and more sophisticated vehicles than thinking of it as once you get in to the locked box that is the infotainment system, all of a sudden you're going to be able to pull off Taylor Swift
Well, what do you think about Mr. Bell's submission, which was a little bit more specific in terms of how you might be able to exceed the bounds of a subscription, whether it is for permanent downloads or, I guess have it on more vehicles than would have been permitted. And you can get the authorized code, I think is what Mr. Williams just said. I don't remember
Right.
the phrase exactly, but.
Yeah, and I don't recall the exact specifics of that. I would say, just like I have on my computer, I can have Spotify, I can save some of those offline. It's still encrypting those offline, that offline media. I would just leave the protection of that copyrighted work in the control of that app, which should be designed to protect the media. And we don't want access to be able to go in and break the Spotify DRM on the entertainment system. We just want to be able to get into the system so that we can read the telemetry data.
Do you want to respond, Mr. Williams?
Sure. I'm not a technologist. I think the way I understand it from talking to Mr. Bell and from Mr. Hughes, who testified on Class 6, is that there are additional protections in place on a PC that are not necessarily in place on a voice assistant or a entertainment system in a vehicle, and that they believe that Mr. Weems was referring to the way Spotify intends you to access copies, which is to temporarily download them while you have a subscription and to no longer retain them when you do not have a subscription. I don't know that would actually be enabled in a vehicle entertainment system. I've never tried to do it with my Spotify account, but I do know that Mr. Bell believed that once you got root access to the entertainment system, you could likely extract, and actually at a rapid pace, copies of your playlist essentially from Spotify.
I think what we just heard from Mr. Weems is that if you could do that, that would be circumvention of another TPM. So this exemption does not grant the ability to do that.
That's not my understanding from Mr. Bell's statement.
I would just like to say that I can't make that assertion broadly across every system in every manufacturer. In the life cycle of a vehicle, how these systems are designed from a security perspective or an architecture perspective changes. When you go through the quarters of let's say of a calendar, and you look at on the surface what looks the same to you and I as the same Volkswagen Passat rolling out over the course of that year has actually changed. For lack of a better term, the brains and the guts of that vehicle has switched from providers to suppliers, depending on costs and other issues that kind of weigh into how that vehicle is manufactured. I can't say blanketly that because of this, then that. When it comes to protection and security.
You think that knowledge is in the hands of the OEMs, or who would have that knowledge?
yeah, at the end of the day, the OEMs are the ones who are designing and setting those requirements.
So a couple of points. So like Tesla, for instance, uses a variant of Ubuntu, which is a general purpose desktop operating system for general purpose computers. Microsoft is a provider of technology for a lot of these things. There's not a technical reason why, if indeed there's not a layer of DPM on these apps, why they couldn't be designed to include it. That's in the hands of the manufacturers. So it's up to them how they design their software with or without that second layer of DPM. What we've heard sort of conflicting information about whether it's there now or not, but there's no reason they couldn't include it.
I'm not sure that's helpful to you, because if they designed it so that the first layer of the TPM is what's supposed to protect the entertainment content, then that would seem to go be a negative in terms of granting this exemption.
If it's, well, I would say that if it's entirely within their power to design it one way or the other, that would create a pretty perverse incentive to have fewer layers of protection for your content, so you can sweep up less sensitive information like software.
If I was designing the systems and I was responsible for protecting the IP that was given to me by the movie studios, I'd absolutely be wanting to design that well and not rely on the thin protection and relatively weak TPM on that entertainment system. I'd use my industrial strength standard encryption we've been hearing about from ACS for the last few days.
Do you mean the protection would come from, like, do you mean the sub-layer of protection?
Right. I would build it into the movie player app that's running on the Ubuntu Tesla player. I'd build it into the Spotify app. I think I wouldn't trust the overall system. I would want any given media player to have its own protection.
Mr. Williams, do you want to respond, and particularly thinking about Mr. Hughes? I can't frankly exactly recall whether the RWA felt like it was within their control or not. What do you think about what this falls to Mr. Hughes?
Sure. Just let me note quickly so I don't forget what I want to get back to, and then I'll respond to that. So, I mean, without getting into the individual commercial contracts between any individual label and any individual service provider or device manufacturer, I think the general picture that Mr. Hughes described is that the record companies make efforts when they negotiate with service providers to try to ensure themselves a certain level of protection. Sometimes they might actually be involved in discussions about the specs of how a TPM will be implemented. Sometimes they may not have that leverage. So not every negotiation is the same, but it is true that in any negotiation related to a subscription service, they are going to be asking for some representations that protections are going to be in place, because the entire design of the service, if it's not advertising supported, is that you only get a certain level of access depending on how much you pay. And even if it's advertising supported, if you're not intended to make copies, then there are TPMs that are supposed to be in place for that. But they don't have control over every aspect of the design, and they don't necessarily have control over the agreement between the service provider and whatever device manufacturer the service provider chooses to allow the service to run on, assuming there is an agreement there. So I think they do make best efforts to try to protect their content. They have every motivation to do so, but they can't completely control the entire design of the system. I think just two more quick points. I think you're right to question the notion that, well, my clients' members should be required to have 16 layers of protection in place. They do have probably that many in some instances for different types of choices that consumers are allowed to make within a service, but each one of those things is important, and Mr. Bell's statement speaks to the fact that from his point of view, the lock on the firmware is part of that overall system, and that it's not that every single piece of the pie falls apart if you get through that lock, but that in his view, some pieces of the pie become exposed, and so it is still a danger. And I think when you compare what we're discussing with what's in the record with respect to the need to repair and modify entertainment systems, there's virtually nothing. I think the one thing that I can recall is a suggestion that someone should be able to turn their entertainment system into a storage unit I don't even understand if that's to store the content that someone wants to record off of a subscription service, or whether it's to port content from outside the vehicle into the system. But that's the only thing I can recall, and I don't think that's enough to justify risking the harm that you identified 3 years ago when they caused you to design the current exemption.
I mean, I think what I'm understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, from the proponents is that the TPM for the infotainment system, the entertainment system, is linked to the system for telematics, and so like that TPM has to be circumvented just to get telematics to repair the car. And I think there is evidence of that on the record.
I think if I understood Mr. Williams, he said that there are instances of that. I don't think he said that was universally true, but he can correct me if I'm wrong.
Can one of the proponents speak to, are there times when, to your knowledge, someone tried to make use of the current temporary exemption on those people and was unable to do so to repair the vehicle, or engage in diagnostic health modification, etc., because it would have involved the telematics system sort of unintentionally, or the side effects? That makes sense.
Yeah, I don't have any specific example of that. I just the trend, the shift. I think that's a better question for Dorman, because I think in DC they did provide some examples of that. Increasingly, what they're seeing is that there are significant challenges. I'd refer you to the current case, Dorman, or GM v. Dorman, where they're suing them for 1201 infringement. Clearly, the GM does not feel that the current exemption is covering what they're doing.
Since we're running low on our time, let's move on to third-party repair. The office, in its 1201 study, said that Congress should consider a legislative clarification to allow for third-party assistance. Can one of you proponents address why a proposed expansion to allow for third-party repair would not violate, or at least sort of trigger, the anti-trafficking provisions in Section 1201?
Sure. So,
Ms. Walsh.
So there are two reasons. So the office doesn't need to write limiting language into the exemption about the type of user. The question is whether people who are users of the copyrighted work are adversely affected in their ability to make non-infringing uses. So sort of off the bat, the exemption doesn't need to say you need to be this kind of user or another kind of user. When we get to the trafficking, there is a specific list of requirements for what kinds of activities rise to the level of unlawful trafficking. So is it primarily a circumvention service or marketed in that way, or having limited commercial significance other than for circumvention? And for repair services, they're primarily repair services. They're not circumvention services. They're not, or at least there is a universe of repair services that don't rise to that level. You can imagine one that is marketed in that way, but there's clearly space between, there's clearly space in the universe of repair services for things that don't necessarily fall under any of those three categories for prohibited trafficking. So the exemption shouldn't foreclose people who are in that space where they're offering a service that doesn't rise to the level of trafficking. The exemption shouldn't foreclose them from engaging in that legitimate activity, and it shouldn't foreclose courts from figuring out where that line is precisely. So if someone offers a service where it's in the gray area, then in order to get the full scope of what the trafficking is supposed to allow people to do, it shouldn't be foreclosed by denying them exemption under 1201A1, because doing that person, their activities potentially implicate both. So an exemption under 1201A1 gets it out of the way so that the scope that's not prohibited under A2 can be explored in the market.
What would you say to Joint Creators' concern that, I guess, I don't know, it's certainly a slippery slope concern that an active circumvention is always for another purpose, and so it's difficult to say whether something is primarily designed for circumvention or primarily designed for repair?
Well, I think we could look at, the statute suggests that sort of the way that it's marketed or the commercial significance are ways of getting at that. So if you're offering a service and the only way that it's commercially significant is the circumvention aspect of it, so then that's something that might be excluded. But if you're offering a service and the primary significance of it is I can get your device to work, then that's an example of something that would not be. So I'm not sure that that's such a unsolvable conundrum.
With respect to, you mentioned that the question that the office raised in its study regarding whether the word user in section 1201 can be interpreted to include third-party repair people. Could you talk a little bit more about whether the office would have authority to use that interpretation, and particularly, wouldn't that implicate to the extent that you're relying on 117, because it would be a user, not an owner, who is doing the repair, and wouldn't that implicate your ability to rely on 117 to cover the repair services?
So user is a broader category than owner. So owners are a type of user. So in that sense, the statute contemplates users. Some of those users will have the benefit of section 117, both for repairs and modifications, since 117A1 does permit modifications. So it's a question again of
117A1's modifications is sort of like in the service of repair, like that sense of functionality, right? That's what the content requires. So I do disagree with that. I mean, I appreciate that you're asking us to go beyond 117, but just in terms of what 117A itself is directed at, I think it is a bit narrower.
Well, the Conti report said that you should be able to add new functionality to, so it's not limited to just making it work the way it originally worked. If you want to make it work with a new machine, for instance, then that's permitted under 117A1. So Krauss and the Conti report.
I have a practical question for Mr. Weems. With respect to agricultural vehicles, there's a lot of discussion in the submissions about the need for third-party repair. Could you talk about what's happening now? Because I read that there were a lot of farmers who lived miles away from a service facility and who were told that it would take 4 months or whatever to get their vehicle repaired, and they had a harvest that needed to happen in the next couple of days. So what are those farmers doing now in a situation like that?
Right. Good question. They do the best they can. Part of this is the farmers are realizing that they need to tool up and learn the code. And so there's a bit of a re-education happening. It's interesting being here in California. Farmers in California are actually a fair ways behind farmers in the Midwest in that regard, because the farmers in the Midwest don't farm all year, and so they have a couple months in the winter to learn the code. So services like Code Academy, and you're seeing, it's interesting, you go into the tractor forums, which I spend a lot of time on, I imagine you don't. And there is increasing technical discussion. There's a lot more comfort around getting in and diving in and understanding things now than there was before there was the exemption. You're also seeing the universities starting to help out. So my alma mater is Cal Poly. It's both an engineering and an ag university. And there is a group of students that has been working with, there's a group of computer engineering students that's been working with the agriculture department, where the ag department has given them access to their tractors, and they have been reverse engineering the tractors under the exemption and starting to put some of the diagnostic information. And I don't think that this was in the record, this got posted afterwards, but the website is tractorhacking.github.io. And it has the results of some of their initial research. So they're working on documenting the interfaces with the goal of building an alternative diagnostic tool that's the equivalent of John Deere's diagnostic laptop software. Their hope is to build an open source diagnostic software. But these are complex machines. The Society of Automotive Engineering standard that the heavy equipment industry is using is complex, and then there's a lot of proprietary John Deere work on top of it. So it's going to be, I think, many years before we have anywhere near the kind of alternative, an alternative that's as functional as John Deere's diagnostic software.
Mr. Meany?
Yeah, I would just I would just caution that, we're talking about tractors here versus millions and millions and millions of light duty vehicles on the road, all falling into the same class. So when we think about the needs of the few outweighing the safety and security of millions of folks who are driving on the roadways every day, I think it's just something that I'd like to consider up against a very specific use case when it comes to agriculture.
Well, I mean, there is a temporary exemption in the registrars to determine which you can recommend renewal of for motorized vehicles with light and heavy duty. And I think we're questioning whether the heavy duty context, whether there is difficulty in the intended beneficiaries being able to actually make use of it.
Okay, yeah, that's fine. I just wanted to clarify. Yeah.
The other thing that I would add is that the third-party limitation is really a challenge. We're seeing increasingly some of these independent, local. There's more of these independent local machinery operators. Or sometimes you have a farmer, where he's good at fixing his equipment, so he fixes it for his neighbors too, and then he's a third party. And so that's if you think about the years of investment that you're going to want for learning how to do this, developing your own tools for your own equipment. Certainly, the more equipment you can work on, the more incentive there's going to be to invest that technical knowledge.
Mr. Zeminski?
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that similarly to Mr. Moody's comment, the needs of the millions far outweigh what the capacity of the original equipment manufacturers can do and what the owners can reasonably do on their own. We need to disseminate that information as far as possible, as broad as possible, so that we can get devices serviced quicker and more efficiently. And if you use the Apple iPhone battery fiasco, all of, doing the math, and we can recite to you the numbers, but it would effectively take Apple 2.7 years just to catch up with the backlog in the United States to be able to do that if you relied strictly on Apple geniuses. If you extended that then to the implications, because iPhones are not limited to the United States, they are all over the world, it becomes a greater problem. Contrarily, independent repair shops in the iFixit network, there are almost 20,000 independent shops just in that network. There are not near that many dealerships or places you can go for authorized service, right?
Mr. Mooney?
Yeah, I just want to clarify that we're in no way against the repair of vehicles. We're talking about a very specific, in the ability for the consumer to do so on their own. We're talking about very specific, circumventing security controls around very specific systems that house copyrighted work or enable copyrighted works, or in instances, data that has systems that have access to safety critical information on the vehicle itself. So,
and what's your specific opposition to allowing an exemption for third-party repair people?
So I think there's a number of ways. There's a number of ways that these vehicles can be serviced as is. We're saying that there are specific concerns around copyrighted works on these systems that we would like to protect, that uphold our ability to compete in the market and be a trusted systems provider to the OEMs.
Mr. Williams?
Thank you. We've made our full case in our written submission in Washington, so I won't repeat all of it. But I just want to say that the associations I'm here representing don't really have a position as a matter of policy on whether it's a good or bad idea to have automobile repair shops and be able to do some of the things that are being discussed, setting aside entertainment systems in the vehicles. But I don't see a legal path for you to create an exemption for those repair shops under the statutory authority that you've been given. And so you refer to it as a bit of a slippery slope argument, and in a way maybe it is, as a matter of policy, that the big concern is this spreads to other areas, but also as a matter of actual statutory authority. I don't think that the term user was intended to say that you could create an exemption that applies to repair shops who are engaged in trafficking. I think that was probably intended to apply to people who, for example, don't own a piece of software, but maybe you're able to find a way to grant them an exemption in certain circumstances, or people who have access to a piece of content through a subscription service and not permanent access, but they want to make a clip. There's other types of users who are not owners of copies that that could be contemplated by that word, and I think you've been right to say that you don't have the authority to grant an exemption that even implies that trafficking is covered in any shape or form.
What about if we were to grant an exemption that circumvention is exempted when it's a necessary step undertaken by or at the direction of the owner of the vehicle?
Yes, I think there may be some circumstance where that would not involve trafficking, but I think in most cases it would. As I understand the automobile market, and I'm not here representing the OEMs, and so I might be incorrect about this, but as I understand it from reading the record, pretty much every instance involves circumvention, and a business where every instance involves circumvention, I think is going to be involved in trafficking. There's also the issue of marketing under the third prong of trafficking, and if you read that too narrowly, I think it would really read it out of the statute, because, for example, you could say, well, I'm not marketing circumvention if I advertise free access to movies. I'm not, but circumvention is required to get you to the access. So,
well, if I paraphrase your positions, Ms. Wallace will paraphrase
yes.
your position to you, she's saying the commercially significant purpose of an independent car repair shop is to fix the car. It's not to engage in circumvention, it's to fix the oil light or whatever is going on with it.
And the commercially significant purpose is only one of three possible trafficking violations. I'm not sure. Well, actually, I don't think I agree with your interpretation, but even if you do, it could still be primarily designed for the purpose of circumvention or marketed in a way that informs consumers that they can achieve something that requires circumvention. And I don't think that kind of marketing should have to include the words, "We will circumvent your access controls." That's that's never going to be the way that something is marketed.
Mr. Williams, can I just probe a little bit more on this and just sort of flip the argument a little bit? What if you were to say that by granting the 1201 exemptions, but then no one could use it, doesn't that really make 1201A ineffective if there's no one that's able to ever use it? In other words, the only time you can go and have some of this work done would be to go to somebody that knows how to make that repair on that John Deere tractor, for example, right? You bought this $50,000 tractor. You've got some problems with it. You figured out kind of what the problem is, but the only way to fix it would be to go to a John Deere. It may take you 2 or 3 months. You've got 2 or 3 days. You've got crops in the field. They're gonna go bad. You've got a neighbor that can fix it. You go to him. He fixes it. Wouldn't that action, if that action becomes trafficking, doesn't that make 1201A a null and void? In other words, you kind of got the first one if you say the second one is can only be narrowly applied in only these handful of things. If you really read those that narrow, does that make sense?
If I'm understanding you, I think you're asking, does it kind of take the oomph out of this proceeding, basically, because an exemption won't practically be able to be used in specific circumstances. I won't adopt all the factual things included in that hypothetical as a scenario that would actually happen exactly in that way, but I understand what you're getting at, I think, and I think from our point of view, you're raising a good policy question, and it's an important policy question, and it's something dealt with in the 1201 study. It's not something that the statute currently enables the librarian to address through an exemption. The one specific instance where Congress did bless that type of a provision was in relation to phone unlocking. There was a very specific bill passed, and the legislative history very clearly says this doesn't imply any authority to do this in other circumstances, and in fact the register previously read that statutory enactment to imply that you need that kind of activity in order to create those kinds of exemptions. So as a matter of policy, whether ultimately that's something Congress should take up or not, I think is a question the office has already dealt with. But it doesn't change the authority that's been given to the office in this procedure.
Well,
Ms. Walsh from the Electronic Input Foundation. What we're talking about now is how to interpret the statutory language that's there. And Mr. Cheney raises the important point that if you interpret it in an overly restrictive way, you defeat the intent of Congress to continue to allow for non-infringing uses. And in creating this rulemaking to have presumably a meaningful impact on vindicating people's right to take advantage of the freedoms that they enjoyed prior to the enactment of the DMCA with regard to these non-infringing uses. So it's legitimate to consider how interpreting it in an overly restrictive way would defeat the purpose of the regime.
Did you want to speak to Mr. Williams' citation or reference to the Unlocking Act?
I think it may be a suggestion that Congress, in the many years between the enactment of the DMCA and the Unlocking Act, has recognized that it's important to be more explicit about the importance of third-party rights. I don't think it suggests that. I don't think it undermines the idea that it's implicit in the original statute. But seeing how the statute has been interpreted, it would make sense as a lawmaker to be really clear that the ability of third parties to help individuals make use of the exemptions is important.
Thank you, Matt Williams. I just wanted to clarify and make sure I wasn't unclear on this point that there are exemptions where people are exercising them and they're not going to service providers. So it's not that I'm saying the whole proceeding in every individualized proposed class of works involves this policy question in the same way. But I understand that with respect to motor vehicles, there's this policy question presented, and there's kind of negotiations that have gone on with the independent repair shops and the OEMs. I'm not here to speak on whether that solved that policy question properly or not, but I think each proposed class is different, and I don't think that issue is presented with respect to every type of proposed class.
Let's move on quickly to tools. I want to pose a similar question that I just did on third-party repair. What authority does the office have, in light of the anti-trafficking provisions, to include an exemption for tools, for unauthorized tools?
I would give the same answer that well, I think it might be, I would give the same answer that not all tools are, meet the requirements to be prohibited under A2, but I'm curious if what kinds of tools are.
Well, so I mean, currently people can develop their own tools. The owner of the vehicle can develop their own tools for repair, and under the MOU that repair shops have with car manufacturers, there are authorized tools that can be licensed. So is there a need for other tools to provide repair services to consumers?
Yeah, so this is something that we discussed extensively in the context of cars and touched on a little bit earlier today in regard to the market for providing diagnostic tools. So the way that an exemption interacts with that is, in order to develop the diagnostic tool, you need to do circumvention to understand the system and what's necessary to do diagnosis and repair. The tool itself is not a circumvention tool. It's a tool that is built using the knowledge that you have gleaned about how the system works. So it doesn't need to circumvent in order to do the diagnosis. It's reading the data that gets sent out by the car. But in order to build that tool, someone needs to have circumvented in order to do the reverse engineering of the device, so that you understand what the codes coming out of it are, if there are undocumented ways of interacting with the software that will let you do repairs that otherwise aren't transparent to independent repair folks, and so on. So that is a tool whose existence is enabled by an exemption that lets you get in and look at it, but it's not a circumvention tool because it doesn't do any circumvention.
So that sounds to me like a tool that is enabled with Hobo 1. Do you disagree?
So there's a space where it's again involves enabling interoperability of hardware, because when you replace a physical component, you need to change the software in the device, like a car, to get it to work correctly with that.
Sure, separately, in that specific example you gave on the diagnostic tool, that's software, right?
So that diagnostic tool, you're trying to understand functional elements of, certainly if the developer of that tool were sued, then 1201F would be raised as a defense. I would expect the other side to argue that it's not interoperability with software, but instead it's a device that is just taking advantage of some kind of information, not necessarily software interoperability.
Is there any legal basis or any authority that the office, I mean, some of the proponents have asked for the ability to distribute or disseminate these tools. That seems to run up against the anti-trafficking provisions. Do you have any argument that the office has the authority to exempt that behavior?
So in the context of making sense of the way that the exemption allows an individual to take advantage, they have interpreted, you have interpreted the verbs that are prohibited in the trafficking provision in light of the whole provision, and found as a commercial scale requirement. So I think that there's room to look at whether non-commercial or personal or otherwise something that's not commercial trafficking is lawful and would help people take advantage of the exemption. Now, a lot of the things that we're talking about that are really important are commercial repair services, so that would not be a complete panacea.
Mr. Weeds, in the agricultural context, can you just talk about like what role do these type of tools play in repair needs?
Sure. I mean, this is developing the diagnostic software. I mean, the hope is that we'll be able to use the circumvention to develop this diagnostic tool, so plug it in and maybe at some point use the circumvention to identify what the error code was. But now we can understand the signals that are coming off the canvas. The agricultural equipment is relatively unsophisticated compared to the automotive vehicles that have infotainment systems. There's simpler, there's fewer DPMs overall, and so I think what Ms. Walsh is referring to, where you can use the circumvention, develop the tool, and then that tool does not do any circumvention itself is very viable. From everything that I understand so far from our investigation, John Deere's technology works in particular.
Hey, sorry.
Mr. Mooney?
So can I just clarify, so what we're talking about? So are you in essence talking about like a sniffer? Essentially, you're saying that it is reading data that is coming off of a product, but that data is benign in some way? I'm just curious. Or it can only be used for good?
I mean, the intent would be benevolent. There are things that you do over standard canvas, like reset the error code, where it's not purely reading data coming off the line. You're communicating your accuracy device like that.
So I just think that's important to clarify, is that there's this benign data that's coming out. So when you're reading, you have the ability to read, there's all kinds of sensitive information flowing back and forth.
This is the telematics.
Yeah, but it's just like the hack of what, of sniffing data, spoofing data, is the fact that you were able to access and see it, which has safety implications from a telematics perspective. If you were able to, so a vehicle is communicating through a number of other systems, that its position, its navigation, where it's going, and the timing of that. If you were able to alter that by a millisecond, that has potentially grave implications for the user. So it's not just this, and I get where you're coming from, but there's more to it when you get to, when you're talking about data flow on and off of a vehicle moving down the highway.
Well, who owns that data?
We don't.
It's my car, it's my data.
So I think how it goes around is that the manufacturer, the OEM, owns that data, or whatever agreements they have with other providers. In most cases, Harman is simply a data enabler, and that we've read a system that provides functionality in some way.
What's the support? So in terms of who owns the data, is there is that sort of under the terms of the the agreement with the owner of the car? Like, what determines who owns the data?
I can't speak to it.
Okay, thank you, that's all helpful. Mr. Weeds, if there were an exemption that allowed for the kind of tools you're talking about, but didn't allow for distribution of those tools, would that fill the need that there is for these kind of tools?
I mean, the distribution is a challenge. We've seen, it's interesting, is I've been looking, the companies who distribute diagnostic tools for heavy equipment for long haul trucks, I've found almost all of them are in Canada and the UK, and none of them are in the US. And so it really seems like there is a stifling that's happening around where the software companies are developing and selling and distributing these tools are trying to stay outside of the United States. So I would see a benefit that is, I think most of the market benefit will come from being able to distribute these tools.
Yeah, can we be clear about what kind, so this
Yeah, I
is
think that's helpful, yeah.
Walsh from EFF. Can we be clear about what kinds of tools we're talking about restricting? Because the diagnostic tools that I've described are not circumvention devices, so I don't know what the basis for restricting their dissemination would be.
I don't think we're suggesting there is, if it's not something prohibited by 1201 H2. So I actually was also confused about that.
Sorry for not being clear. But I mean, the proponents have asked for circumvention tools as well.
But I mean, I wonder if Mr. Weems can explain if something is only in Canada, why 1201 is the cause of that.
Well, those are potentially tools, I mean, different classes of tools that you can develop, so those probably are tools that involve circumventions.
So what type of tools would those be if they're not for diagnosis?
Well, yeah, I mean, some of the existing prepared tools, I mean, there's different classes of things that you can do. Some of the tools would require a circumvention and some of the tools would not. So, you know, various levels of how you can go.
Also, Chris Walsh again from EFF. If you have a prohibition on doing reverse engineering that allows you to develop the tool, then it makes sense that you don't get that tool in the jurisdiction that has the prohibition.
But right now there is an exemption that for repair, and we have said that the ability to develop or make use self-help to find a tool would be encompassed within that. So I'm not.
But if you think about if I'm going to a venture capitalist and asking for money and I want to create a software company and start developing these tools, and the exemption might go away in 2 years, it's going to be very hard for me to get funding.
Well, we're not in a position of adopting any kind of exemptions. That's a legislative matter. So.
Oh, I totally understand. I'm saying that might be another reason that you see these happening overseas.
Absolutely.
Mr. Williams?
Yeah, just quickly, I think you understand this and that's why you're asking the questions, but I think this topic is something you've got to be really careful with if you're trying to design it in a way that enables certain tool generation by beneficiaries of exemptions without getting into the trafficking provisions. And I think there are instances where an individual who has an exemption and wants to exercise their rights under that exemption could create a tool for that purpose, that type of personal use. I think you would need to look at, is the manufacturer of the tool or the importation of the tool for the purpose of exercising one of these 3 prohibited activities, and if you decide that a repair shop is prohibited under those 3 prongs from doing what it does, then the manufacturer of the tool by that shop becomes something that there shouldn't be an exemption for. So I think that's a hard line to draw. Hopefully I'm being clear, but I do think there are times when people can make a tool that doesn't qualify as trafficking, and I do think this is about trafficking, as it says otherwise traffic. But just drawing that line would require a lot of care.
Thank you.
Just a quick question about the MOU, just to clarify the record. So under the MOU, is it that tools for diagnosis are available, or we're talking about tools for repair? And in either case, are those so basically allowed tools from the manufacturers, but the actual circumvent when they either diagnose or repair?
Sure. Yeah, if you have the tool from the manufacturer with the key in it, then there's no circumvention because you're basically authorized by the manufacturer to do that. So that's what the MOU says, is that the manufacturer would have to make available those tools. Unfortunately, the tools under the MOU are only your standard like CAN bus level tools. They are not telemetry, telematics level tools. And so, you know, you have levels of repair. It's allowing certain, you can do a certain set of repairs under the MOU, but over time, as these vehicles get more sophisticated, there are other repairs that are not allowed. And I think Aaron Lowe referred to ongoing discussions. They're finding that the MOU was insufficient, and they're looking for additional remedies.
So I guess a follow-up question for Mr. Mooney is, so if these tools in the MOU are essentially circumventing, it sounds like in some cases, why is it okay for these repair shops to use those tools to circumvent, but then not, like, how does someone, because you're talking about like security and everything else, I want to know like how the tools offered under the MOU meet your security concerns.
Well,
Presumably they do.
Well, yeah, well, again, a lot of this falls within the manufacturer who's selling to a dealer who then, is working with authorized repair or service providers. There is a handshake of sorts that goes on between the manufacturer at the dealer level or the repair level to be able to get keys or codes or tools to access systems within that vehicle. I think that's and to me that's okay. I mean, if there's some sort of process by which that takes place, in which it does already, then there's no objection on that to my opinion.
Do you,
It's a different topic.
do you have something else to say on this class?
Yes.
Okay.
So I just want to point out, as you think about, you've asked a couple of questions about scoping the devices that are involved. So we think that the record demonstrates that the need is not limited to a particular kind of device. I'd point out that section 117 is not restricted in terms of what machines are contemplated. It doesn't exclude entertainment devices. I would say, to the extent that you are persuaded that the speculative concern about potential copyright infringement justifies narrowing the class, I'll throw out alternative language to consider, such as excluding a device that is primarily a media playback device for audiovisual works and sound recordings. Again, just to reiterate, don't think that such an exclusion is warranted.
Mr. Mooney? I think this is sort of last call for anyone on this class.
Yeah, so nothing additional. I just wanted to make an important note of it here before I think we close out, is that Harman is a wholly owned, and this is more for the record, we're a wholly owned independent subsidiary of Samsung. However, any comment that was made here today or any position or opinion is of Harman, not of Samsung.
Thank you. Mr. Williams?
Just very quickly, I appreciate Ms. Walsh's attempt to offer some limiting language, and although I can't endorse what she offered, I'd be happy to work with you on any language that you want to try to craft.
Thank you. Mr. Reeves?
I'd just like to thank you for considering this topic. The environmental implications of the decision that you make will be far sweeping and potentially have greater implications than a lot of the decisions that some of your colleagues at EPA may be making right now. This is a very big deal, and the tools and ideas and techniques that are developed in the repair industry in the United States are reverberating throughout the world. This is really important, and I appreciate your dedication to this.
Thank you. We appreciate everyone's participation.